My name is Rick Mannon, and I'm an inductee into the Brantford Area Sports Hall of Recognition. I'm honored to be interviewing two sons, Bob and Tom Maich, whose father was Bill Maich, one of Canada's greatest heavyweight boxers in the 1920s and 30s. Bill Maich was officially inducted into the Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame in 1977, and also is an inductee into the Brantford Area Sports Hall of Recognition. Bill held titles ranging from Ontario Regional Champion to Provincial Champion to Canadian Champion to North American Heavyweight Champion. He fought more than 100 bouts over his amateur and professional career and knocked out approximately 80% of his opponents. Bill Maich was reportedly never to have been knocked out himself. One of Bill's many nicknames was the Jack Dempsey of Canada, and another was the Brantford Hercules. Bill's parents escaped the Ukraine in the early 1900s and finally made their home in Brantford sometime after 1910. So tell us a bit about the background and the beginning. Why and how did your dad, Bill, start?
Very interesting. He was born June 2010, oldest of 8 brothers and sisters. And at the age of about 11, he dropped out of grade 7 at Echo Place School and took newspapers on the street corner and worked on the small family farm here in Brantford to help out his parents and younger brothers and sisters. That led him, when he had some playtime, how he got into boxing really began with baseball, where they'd have pickup games of baseball, unorganized, just he and his friends. And he saw himself, or dreamed of being a professional pitcher, until one day one of his friends brought an old battered pair of boxing gloves, and they started a play fight with the boxing gloves. And after a while, when no one could really stand up to him, he decided, geez, I better look into this boxing. And at about the age of 15, he started to hang around the Brantford Armories, Dufferin Rifles Regiment, who had military boxers and training facilities. And after hanging around there a while, they said, hey, he couldn't afford anything, of course. They said, here, train with us. And 15, 16 years of age, he trained with these older military boxers, and it was quite a military boxing time in those days, and ended up having his first fight when he was 17 years old against, I won't go into the names, a 23-year-old who'd had several fights. Won that fight, had a second fight, knocked the guy out, and finally the third fight, which was within 12 months of his first fight, he was 17 or 18, he fought a fighter from Hamilton called Cuts Carreri, who the next year, within 12 months, was light heavyweight champion of Canada. He lost a decision, but you'll find my father's, Bill Maich's perseverance, determination, a few years later, he beat Carreri for the Ontario Championship.
I think the other thing, too, that's interesting to recognize is our dad fought primarily between 1927 and 37, so it was the heart of the Depression. And part of the reality of, with a family of 8, was not everybody had jobs, and employment in Brantford was pretty bad at the time. A lot of the farm machinery equipment manufacturers were borderline out of business, not exporting anything. And I think boxing was a way simply to pick up a few dollars. It wasn't a hell of a lot, but it helped out the family a great deal. And I think once he realized, as Bob says, that he was pretty good even at 17, 18, 19, he started to aspire to fight outside of the city.
His challenge throughout his 10-year boxing career from 1927 to 1937, he was self-trained, self-managed, everything. He didn't have a manager or promoter or whatever, and he had difficulty, and the challenge in that fight with the light heavyweight champion was an example. The only people that they'd make a match with him because of his knockout power were more experienced fighters, and the Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame summarized his career with newspapers and press saying that he had more than 100 fights. Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame documented 70 of those fights, 80% of which he won by knockout in 4 rounds, many of them, if not most of them, in the first or second round. But it was one of the an example of why it was very difficult for him to get fights, except with much more experienced fighters. But he did okay.
One of the other things was, going back to that depression aspect, there weren't gyms in Brantford, there was some in Hamilton and Toronto, but he ended up, because of the status and amount of money they had, basically using his younger brother Don as a sparring partner, and the only place they ever really worked out for years was in their basement at their farmhouse. So you can imagine they did skipping and some jumping, and then they'd spar, and it used to be quoted in the Expositor as an example of brotherly love. So it's quite funny.
What are some of your dad's career highlights?
In his 10-year career, Southwestern Ontario heavyweight champion various years, Western Ontario heavyweight champion various years, Ontario heavyweight champion 1933 and 34, Canadian heavyweight champion 1933 and 34, North American heavyweight champion in 34. That's when he, and Tom can expand on this, that's when he fought the U.S. heavyweight champion Stan Evans from Detroit. And Bill Maich, our dad, won a decision for the U.S. Title. Tom, you should expand on who Stan Evans was. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting story. Bob will get back into some of the Canadian championships, and he was a major winner right across Canada, whether he fought in PEI or Winnipeg or Toronto. But Buffalo was a hotbed of boxing, Western New York, in those days, in the late 20s and 30s. And Dad went down there finally after there was no opponents left in Canada. He had only about 3 fights, all of which he had won by knockout. In fact, the Buffalo papers, you got to remember this is before TV, so papers are really giving the story of the sports events. Dad was on something like a 17 or 18 knockout streak, and so they paired him up on his 4th fight in the States with the U.S. Amateur champion, a guy named Stan Evans. And the connection with Stan Evans is that he fought and beat Joe Louis. And if somebody's watching this knows their boxing history, Joe Louis is recognized in most corners as being the greatest heavyweight of all time. He held the championship belt between 1937 and 1949, 12 years. Even Ali didn't hold it for that long. So Louis was really the Ali of his era. And the fact that Stan Evans beat Joe Louis, and our dad managed to fight and beat Stan Evans in a 5-round match is really quite something. Dad never did fight Joe Louis, but it makes you wonder, had that fight ever happened, what might have been. And this was a huge fight. The Buffalo papers said it was the greatest fight in the last 5 or 10 years in the Buffalo area. They had to change the venue. They sold so many tickets. Initially, they had to move to a second venue. So it's clearly one of the big highlights of his career.
At about that time, he moved to train in Buffalo, New York, with a manager who at that time was managing the, as I recall, the lightweight world champion. I've got their names here. And the middleweight boxing champion. So finally he had a manager and a trainer and a facility to train in, and he stayed in Buffalo about a year. And they were touting him in the newspapers if you ran through all the thousands of clippings we've run through, because believe it or not, we weren't born yet. Some of the people he fought went on to professional fighting, of course, as my dad did. But we'll get to why did he semi-retire at a certain point in time, but it did have something to do with his last fight in Madison Square Gardens.
Well, I've got a quick story just on the Buffalo theme. There were 2 boxers. Nobody will have heard of these guys, but they were big New York guys at the time. Big Boy Brackey And if you can believe it, the other fighter was a guy named Young Hippo, as in hippopotamus. And these guys were professionals who did fight some of the top contenders in that Lewis era. And Dad was down there, again, this is in the early time in Buffalo, and he actually was asked to spar with Big Boy Brackey and with Young Hippo. And believe it or not, our dad sparred with both guys on the same day and actually knocked down Big Boy Brackey. So the papers were saying that here's this Canadian guy coming in, not only beating Evans, but now is handling Brackey, who was supposedly the big up and rising star. So that was another kind of humorous highlight.
Now, you mentioned that your dad did temporarily retire, and then he came back as Canadian champion, and then he retired at his prime at 27 years old.
Yes.
Maybe you can explain some of the circumstances around that?
The turning point, and this was covered by, and I'm not sure whether it was Ted Reeve or Lou Marsh, famous at that time Toronto Telegram columnists, but they told the story very clearly, where my father and the manager, who I'm not naming for legal reasons, although I'm sure he's long gone, he fought for a $500 purse, which in 1934-33 was, well, you can project the money, was a lot of money. He knocks the guy out in Madison Square Gardens, goes back to the dressing room to get his cut of the purse from his manager, and he can't find the manager, and this is according to the column. My father tended not to be a complainer. He was a very strong guy, but very humble. So he got some tips from people in the dressing room that said what bar or nightclub the manager might be at. So he walked to, since he had no money, he walked to the nightclub, found the manager, and had a calm conversation where he said, "I'd like my $500 now," and the manager then explained the quote expenses, training expenses and so on, which according to the column, and my father confirmed it was a few bucks, was $6 that my father owed the manager. And with no money in his pocket in New York City, had to find a way home. Unfortunately, he made at least the acquaintance of a barber where he got his hair cut before the fight, went and borrowed $1 or so, whatever train fare was, from the barber, and came back to Brantford and was basically retired in 35 and 36.
When Dad first fought for the Canadian Heavyweight Championship, which was held in Winnipeg,
Yeah.
and he was, I think, 22 years of age. And a big part of the story, as reported in the papers, was the fact he went out there, knocked the guy out, a guy named Evans, and I think it was 87 seconds of the first round. So standing up with that kind of history and profile he had as being one punch Bill or dynamite Bill Maich, knocked the guy out real quick. And that's an important part of the story. But the other part, in reading a bunch of these clippings over the last few months, that I think is even more interesting, kind of ties into the hall and the community, is just how much the Brantford community supported Bill in his quest to go out west. Because coming back to this money thing, he wasn't collecting big purses, didn't have somebody to front the money to get out to Winnipeg. So Mayor McBride at the time started a fundraiser when he kicked it off by kicking in, I think, $5, and a couple of councillors kicked in some money. By the end of it, and they reported all this in the Expositor, there were just kind of normal people, working class people, kicking in 25 cents, a buck, whatever they could. And but for that money, Dad would have never become Canadian champ, because he couldn't afford to take the train and pay for accommodation in Winnipeg. That happened not only in Winnipeg, but when he went to Montreal for the British Empire game trials, same thing, fundraiser. The great thing, he came back from Winnipeg, he came back from Montreal, and either Mayor McBride or some of the other councillors would meet him at the train station. So it was really a fan admiration, mutual support, and it worked really well, I think, for the community as well as for our dad. The other thing too, when you read a lot of these articles in Toronto and particularly in Buffalo and some of the Montreal ones in 34 around the British Empire Games. They talk about depression being bad, Brantford's not exporting much manufacturing, but they've exported Bill Maich, and Bill Maich has put Brantford on the sports map of Canada. And, you know, it's really kind of neat to think about that in that era.
That community support was when he was financed to go to Montreal for the Canadian Championship, which he won again, knocking out Steve Neary in 55 seconds of the first round. And then, of course, British Empire Games, across the ocean, big-time expenses, and the community, the mayor, and everybody really coalesced. It's a tremendous story.
And we'll get into this a little bit later, but this community tie-in, what I find amazing, I guess this is me being an old history major amongst other things, is not only was that the case in 33, but years later he was recognized, and Bob will talk to this in more detail, the Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame in the mid-70s. And at that time, Mayor Charles Bowen presented a civic plaque for citizenry and sportsmanship. And then, of course, we have the induction in 84. So it's a real interesting historical tie-in over the better part of, I guess, what, 60, 70 years. And to think now, 2014, with a revitalized hall, to again be part of that, it's exciting to the family. And I'm sure to Dad.
Yeah, you know, we're trying to do our dad well. It is a human interest story as well as a sports story.
Now, when your dad retired, I understand there's an interesting story, what he did with his life after that.
Well, he had the temporary retirement in 1935 and 34, and then in August of 1937, he came out of retirement to fight for the then vacant Canadian Professional Heavyweight Boxing Championship in Prince Edward Island, and that's when he knocked out George Leslie, who was favored. Dad was fighting at that time at about he was 6 feet tall, about 210 pounds. And the man he fought, George Leslie, was 6'4", 215 pounds. And he wins in a first round knockout of 77 seconds. Then the human interest comes. Why did he not continue fighting? Just before my time, he decides to get married to Agnes Soroka, Agnes Maich. And I won't go into, then this may be something you want to edit out, but he went to a rally with an evangelist named Billy Sunday, was famous at the time, the Billy Graham of his time. And as our father would say it, I found Jesus, I took Jesus into my life, and I decided to fight for my family, which was beginning to come along, and for what I believed in. And I didn't like the idea anymore of going into the ring at 27, 28 and beating people up. And thereafter, he'd go on speaking tours, and I remember some of them firsthand because even when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, he'd go to Toronto or London, typically in Ontario, to church halls, churches, and town halls, and talk about his boxing career, which was sort of inspirational, but his real message was, do the best at whatever you believe in. Believe in your dreams. You can do anything if you never give up. And it would then bleed over into a testimony of his belief in God and how God had changed his life. And that may be irrelevant to the Sports Hall of Fame, but it tells you something about the kind of man he was.
I think there's another aspect too that, again, when you review some of the history in the newspaper articles, it's pretty clear to me that in his latter bouts, when he was fighting a little less in Buffalo and PEI and so on, he really didn't seem to have the same absolute killer instinct that he had been noted for. And I remember one of the Buffalo papers earlier in his career had said, you need 3 things to be a heavyweight champion of the world. One is knockout power, which Dad had in spades, and had the one punch early round knockout ability. The second was killer instinct, and it went on at some length that Dad had plenty of killer instinct, especially when he was hurt. And the third was, can you take punishment? And Dad proved with some of these Buffalo guys especially that he could take the punishment as well as dole it out. But I think it's very clear when you read some of the articles about his fights in the last year, 2 years of his career, he was not absolutely finishing these guys off. There's 2 or 3 boxers, I won't go into their names, who were knocked down 2 or 3 times within a round, and Dad, instead of absolutely finishing them up, was half holding them up as they staggered on their feet across the ring. And I don't think his heart was in it the same way, and for reasons Bob suggested, he was focused on family and career and spiritual things.
And it relates to it a bit because I was the eldest in our family. And so I asked him as a young teenager to teach me how to box. He was not the kind of person to talk much about his boxing career. He had to draw it out of it. He was a humble, tough guy. And he said, I'll do that on one condition. I'll teach you how to fight if you promise me you'll never go in a boxing ring. So I happened to play football, basketball, and use some of those skills at times on the football field or the basketball court. I'm not too proud of that, but it stood me in good stead. And if you looked at my record, I feel I'm undefeated. Of course, we tend to rewrite history.
I remember, it's funny, just talking about Dad and his training the kids in boxing. I remember I would have been about 12 years of age, and in those days we didn't have a lot of organized sports, so I had some of my buddies over. We were going to box in the backyard. Dad came out, gave a few pointers, and then we all took turns boxing each other. Well, it must have lasted all of about 15 minutes because each guy liked to hand out the punishment and the punches, but nobody, including myself, liked getting it in the nose or the face. So it was one effort, no potential boxing career for us.
That's great. Well, you mentioned this already, but I think it's an important message. If your dad was still alive today, what advice do you think he would want to share with a young aspiring athlete?
Well, let me start off and then Bob can wrap up. I think there's 2 ways to look at this. One, what Bob and I think based on our individual experiences, and then there's a quote from the expositor, a short one I want to read that I think sums it up. But I think Dad would say, try your best, work hard, true work ethic, blue-collar work ethic to be the best you can be, leave it all out on the playing field. The second thing, absolutely, is to play fair. You know, be honest, play fair. And I think the third key point is, it's as important what you do outside the ring as it is inside the ring. So I think for us, at least from my perspective, he role modeled a lot of this stuff for us in the years that we never saw him box. But when you read the articles, it's clear what kind of man he was. Family man, took care of his family. And let me just be real quick on something that I just came across the other day in the expositor. And the timing of this was before he went out to Winnipeg to win his first Canadian belt. So this was written when they didn't know whether he was going to win or lose. And they talk about him being a self-made man and no agent, no coaches, no gym. But this is a quote that really caught me was, Bill Maich may not bring the championship back. If he does, it will be a significant triumph for him. If he fails, he can be classed among those athletes who gave everything. Those men never lose. They are always winners. And I think that's what he'd want people to think about.
And just to add, and this is a quote rather than mine, this is from the Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame, that sort of summarizes and relates to what he would say today. Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame article says, it's a long way for Bill Maich from selling papers on Brantford street corner at the age of 11 through Ontario, Canadian, and North American championship fights. But Bill Maich has done it his way and still has the courage and conviction and still demonstrates that courage that makes him what he is today. Husband, father, grandfather, champion, but most of all a man. One quote I do remember, a lesson he gave me, especially since I was going into business. he said, "Bob, always remember, you don't judge the quality of the man by the size of his wallet."
One other question I have for you is, what does it mean to you, sons, that your father's inducted into the Brantford Area Sports Hall of Recognition?
It's terrific. He was, I think the first year of induction was 1984 in the previous iteration, and he was in the class of 1984 according to the list I saw. What it means to us is he's not forgotten. We'll never forget him, but he served the community, he served his family, his siblings. He set us, along with our mother, of course, we can't ignore, on a course, and we ended up okay. Lawyer, businessman, registered nurse, my sister Nancy, and x-ray technologist Pam. Opportunities. And one thing both he and my mother always said and would say to an athlete: do your best, all the things that Tom said, but get an education, have opportunities that you might not otherwise have. And that certainly worked for his family, and he and my mother didn't have that opportunity for education, in his case past grade 11.
I think the legacy factor is obviously very important, and I like to think the recognition that the Hall is putting together is not strictly for the sports accomplishments, which are wonderful things for everybody who's in the Hall, but all those other things that all the athletes, not just our dad, bring to the community, and that tie in with the population and with the mayor and so on and so on. And I think we're very proud to be part of the Hall with so many other great athletes, and I think preserving the history is a fantastic initiative that the city and the Sports Hall team have put together. And we're really honored and proud to be here today, and we're talking for the rest of our family too. And it's also, I'll tell you just a little side story, something that I hope will get our children a little more interested in the history of the family as well. So they'll be able to look back and have some laughs at this interview, I'm sure.
That's for sure. This is an article George Hees, who was then the cabinet minister in the government, federal government of transport and business or something. And Dad and he fought at Maple Leaf Gardens. He was a Toronto Argonaut football player in the mid-30s and an athlete and a big strapping guy. He decided he was going to try boxing, so they boxed in Maple Leaf Gardens. I forget how many seconds of the first round he knocked George Hees, and I remember the quote in one of the newspaper clippings was, Maich clips him with a right with a fist the size of a hand. The big good-looking guy lands on his face, and the promoter, Ben Stockley, as I recall, whispers into the reporter's ear. He says, "Listen, when they fall in their mush, they're not getting up." They had another fight. He's lasted to the second round and got knocked out. And then in the early 70s, he comes to Brantford and he recalls, George Hees recalls, and that's a picture of my father and he at that time, getting knocked out twice. And even in his obituary, which was in Maclean's magazine, of all the things, George Hees passes away, a famous politician and everything else, at 85 years of age. But somehow they managed to put in a sentence here, went to Trinity College, silver spoon in his mouth. He compensated for his failure at high school football with a grim training schedule that eventually made him a star linebacker with the Toronto Argonauts that won the 1938 Grey Cup. He had also tested himself by taking up boxing and being flattened by Canadian heavyweight champion Bill Maich in a brutal round at Maple Leaf Gardens in '33. And then Hees went on to beat boxing champion of British Army, but I thought it was something 40, 50 years after the fact. of all the things you put in your obituary, one of his memories was
You know, another
this.
aspect of that, though, is the build-up to the fight is almost more interesting than the fight, because this Hees was a very wealthy guy, private school guy, and, you know, Dad's a guy who never finished elementary school, coming from industrial heartland of Brantford, so it was really paired up that way. They were both pretty good-looking guys, too, so they were playing this Hollywood looks and more women than usual coming out to watch the fight. And it was all with the expectation that Hees was going to win and add another notch to his belt of being this all-around great guy. So as Bob tells the story, it didn't turn out that way, and it made for laughs over many decades, so it was good. There's a lot of those.
There's a million stories like
Thanks,
that.
Rick, for doing this. This is great.